Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Will to Power, and we are up to Section 3, entitled Christian Ideals. And with that said, I will go ahead and read aphorism number 217. War against the Christian ideal, against the doctrine of blessedness and salvation as the aims of life, against the supremacy of the fools, of the pure in heart, of the suffering, and of the botched. When and where has any man, of any note at all, resembled the Christian ideal? At least in the eyes of those who are psychologists and triers of the heart and reins. Look at all Plutarch's heroes. 218. Our claim to superiority. We live in an age of comparisons. We are able to calculate as men have never yet calculated. In every way we are history become self-conscious. We enjoy things in a different way. We suffer in a different way. Our instinctive activity is the comparison of an enormous variety of things. We understand everything. We experience everything. We no longer have a hostile feeling left within us. However disastrous the results may be to ourselves, our plunging and almost lustful inquisitiveness attacks, unabashed, the most dangerous of subjects. Quote, "Everything is good," end quote. It gives us pain to say nay to anything. We suffer when we feel that we are sufficiently foolish to make a definite stand against anything. At bottom, it is we scholars who today are fulfilling Christ's teachings most thoroughly. 219. We cannot suppress a certain irony when we contemplate those who think they have overcome Christianity by means of modern natural science. Christian values are by no means overcome by such people. Christ on the cross is still the most sublime symbol, even now. 220. The two great nihilistic movements are A. Buddhism, B. Christianity. The latter has only just about reached a state of culture in which it can fulfill its original object. It has found its level, and now it can manifest itself without disguise. 221. We have re-established the Christian ideal. It now only remains to determine its value. 1. Which value does it deny? What does the ideal that opposes it stand for? Pride, pathos of distance, great responsibility, exuberant spirits, splendid animalism, the instincts of war and of conquest, the deification of passion, revenge, cunning, anger, voluptuousness, adventure, knowledge. The noble ideal is denied. The beauty, wisdom, power, pomp and awfulness of the type of man, the man who postulates aims, the future man. Here Christianity presents itself as the logical result of Judaism. 2. Can it be realized? Yes, of course, when the climactic conditions are favorable, as in the case of the Indian ideal. Both neglect the factor work. It separates a creature from a people, a state, a civilized community, and jurisdiction. It rejects education, wisdom, the cultivation of good manners, acquisition, and commerce. It cuts adrift everything which is of use and value to men. By means of an idiosyncrasy of sentiment, it isolates a man. It is non-political, anti-national, neither aggressive nor defensive, and only possible within a strictly ordered state or state of society, which allows these holy parasites to flourish at the cost of their neighbors. 3. It has now become the will to be happy, and nothing else. Blessedness stands for something self-evident that no longer requires any justification. Everything else, the way to live and let live, is only a means to an end. But what follows is the result of a low order of thought. The fear of pain, of defilement, of corruption, is great enough to provide ample grounds for allowing everything to go to the dogs. This is a poor way of thinking and is the sign of an exhausted race. We must not allow ourselves to be deceived. Become as little children, natures of the same order, Francis of Assisi, neurotic, epileptic, visionary like Jesus. 222. The higher man distinguishes himself from the lower by his fearlessness and his readiness to challenge misfortune. It is a sign of degeneration when eudaimonistic values begin to prevail, physiological fatigue and enfeeblement of willpower. Christianity, with its prospects of blessedness, is the typical attitude of mind of a suffering and impoverished species of man. Abundant strength will be active, will suffer, and will go under. To it, the bigotry of Christian salvation is bad music and hieratic posing and vexation. 223. Poverty, humility, and chastity are dangerous and slanderous ideals, but like poisons, which are useful cures in the case of certain diseases, they were also necessary in the time of the Roman Empire. All ideals are dangerous, because they lower and brand realities. They are all poisons, but occasionally indispensable as cures. 224. God created man, happy, idle, innocent, and immortal. Our actual life is a false, decadent, and sinful existence, a punishment. Suffering, struggle, work, and death are raised as objections against life. They make life questionable, unnatural, something that must cease, and for which one not only requires, but also has, remedies. Since the time of Adam, man has been in an abnormal state. God himself delivered up his Son for Adam's sin, in order to put an end to the abnormal conditions of things. The natural character of life is a curse. To those who believe in him, Christ restores normal life. He makes them happy, idle, and innocent. But the world did not become fruitful without labor. Women do not bear children without pain. Illness has not ceased. Believers are served just as badly as unbelievers in this respect. All that has happened is that man is delivered from death and sin. Two assertions which allow of no verification, and which are therefore emphasized by the Church with more than usual heartiness. He is free from sin, not owing to his own efforts, not owing to a vigorous struggle on his part, but redeemed by the death of the Savior, consequently perfectly innocent and paradisaical. Actual life is nothing more than an illusion, that is to say, a deception, an insanity. The whole of struggling, fighting, and real existence, so full of light and shade, is only bad and false. Everybody's duty is to be delivered from it. Quote, man, innocent, idle, immortal, and happy, end quote. This concept, which is the object of the most supreme desires, must be criticized before anything else. Why should guilt, work, death, and pain, and from the Christian point of view also knowledge, be contrary to all supreme desires? The lazy Christian notions, blessedness, innocence, immortality. 225. The eccentric concept holiness does not exist. God and man have not been divorced from each other. Miracles do not exist. Such spheres do not exist. The only one to be considered is the intellectual, that is to say, the symbolically psychological. As decadence, a counterpart to Epicureanism. Paradise, according to Greek notions, was only Epicurus's garden. A life of this sort lacks a purpose. It strives after nothing. A form of the Epicurean gods. There is no longer any reason to aim at anything, not even at having children. Everything has been done. 226. They despised the body. They did not reckon with it. Nay, more, they treated it as an enemy. It was their delirium to think that a man could carry a beautiful soul about in a body that was a cadaverous abortion. In order to inoculate others with this insanity, They had to present the concept beautiful soul in a different way, and to transvalue the natural value until at last a pale, sickly, idiotically exalted creature, something angelic, some extreme perfection and transfiguration, was declared to be the higher man. 227. Ignorance is not psychological. The Christian has no nervous system. Contempt for and deliberate and willful turning away from the demands of the body and the naked body. It is assumed that all this is in keeping with man's nature and must perforce work the ultimate good of the soul. All functions of the body are systematically reduced to moral values. Illness itself is regarded as determined by morality. It is held to be the result of sin, or it is a trial or a state of salvation, through which man becomes more perfect than he could become in a state of health. Pascal's idea. Under certain circumstances, there are willful attempts at inducing illness. 228. What in sooth is this struggle against nature on the part of the Christian? We shall not, of course, let ourselves be deceived by his words and explanations. It is nature against something which is also nature. With many it is fear, with others it is loathing. With yet others it is the sign of a certain intellectuality, the love of a bloodless and passionless ideal. And in the case of the most superior men, it is love of an abstract nature. These try to live up to their ideal. It is easily understood that humiliation in the place of self-esteem, anxious cautiousness towards the passions, emancipation from the usual duties, whereby a higher notion of rank is created. The incitement to constant war on behalf of enormous issues, habituation to effusiveness of feelings. All this goes to constitute a type. In such a type, the hypersensitiveness of a perishing body preponderates, that the nervousness and the inspirations it engenders are interpreted differently. The taste of this kind of creature tends either 1. To subtilize, 2. To indulge in bombastic eloquence, or 3. To go in for extreme feelings. The natural inclinations do get satisfied, but they are interpreted in a new way, for instance, as justification before God, the feeling of redemption through grace. Every undeniable feeling of pleasure becomes, interpreted in this way, pride, voluptuousness, etc. General problem. What will become of the man who slanders and practically denies and belittles what is natural? As a matter of fact, the Christian is an example of exaggerated self-control. In order to tame his passions, he seems to find it necessary to extirpate or crucify them. 229. Man did not know himself physiologically throughout the ages his history covers. He does not even know himself now. The knowledge, for instance, that man has a nervous system, but no soul, is still the privilege of the most educated people. But man is not satisfied in this respect to say he does not know. A man must be very superior to be able to say, I do not know this. That is to say, to be able to admit his ignorance. Suppose he is in pain or in a good mood. He never questions that he can find the reason of either condition if he only seeks. In truth, he cannot find the reason, for he does not even suspect where it lies. What happens? He takes the result of his conditions for its cause. For instance, if he should undertake some work, really undertaken because his good mood gave him the courage to do so, and carry it through successfully, behold, the work itself is the reason of his good mood. As a matter of fact, his success was determined by the same cause as that which brought about his good mood. That is to say, the happy coordination of physiological powers and functions. He feels bad. Consequently, he cannot overcome a care, a scruple, or an attitude of self-criticism. He really fancies that his disagreeable condition is the result of his scruple, of his sin, or of his self-criticism. But after profound exhaustion and prostration, a state of recovery sets in. How is it possible that I can feel so free, so happy? It is a miracle. Only a God could have effected this change. Conclusion: He has forgiven my sin. From this follows certain practices. In order to provoke feelings of sinfulness and to prepare the way for crushed spirits, it is necessary to induce a condition of morbidity and nervousness in the body. The methods of doing this are well known. Of course, nobody suspects the causal logic of the fact. The maceration of the flesh is interpreted religiously. It seems like an end in itself, whereas it is no more than a means of bringing about that morbid state of indigestion which is known as repentance, the fixed idea of sin, the hypnotizing of the hen by means of the chalk line sin. The mishandling of the body prepares the grounds for the required range of guilty feelings, that is to say, for that general state of pain which demands an explanation. On the other hand, the method of salvation may also develop from the above. Every dissipation of the feelings, whether prayers, movements, attitudes, or oaths, has been provoked, and exhaustion follows. Very often it is acute, or it appears in the form of epilepsy. And behind this condition of deep somnolence there come signs of recovery, or in religious parlance, salvation. 230. Formerly, the conditions and results of physiological exhaustion were considered more important than healthy conditions and the results, and this was owing to the suddenness, fearfulness, and mysteriousness of the former. Men were terrified by themselves and postulated the existence of a higher world. People have ascribed the origin of the idea of two worlds, on this side of the grave and the other beyond it, to sleep and dreams, to shadows, to night, and to the fear of nature. But the symptoms of physiological exhaustion should, above all, have been considered. Ancient religions have quite special methods of disciplining the pious into states of exhaustion, in which they must experience such things. The idea was that one entered into a new order of things, where everything ceases to be known, the semblance of a higher power. 231. Sleep is the result of every kind of exhaustion. Exhaustion follows upon all excessive excitement. In all pessimistic religions and philosophies, there is a yearning for sleep. The very notion, sleep, is deified and worshipped. In this case, the exhaustion is racial. Sleep, regarded psychologically, is only a symbol of a much deeper and longer compulsion to rest. In praxis, it is death which rules here in the seductive image of its brother, sleep. 232. The whole of the Christian training in repentance and redemption may be regarded as a folly circulaire, arbitrarily produced, though of course it can be produced only in people who are predisposed to it, that is to say, who have morbid tendencies in their constitutions. 233. Against remorse and its purely psychical treatment. To be unable to have done with an experience is already a sign of decadence. This reopening of old wounds, this wallowing in self-contempt and depression, is an additional form of disease. No quote-unquote salvation of the soul ever results from it, but only a new kind of spiritual illness. These conditions of salvation, of which the Christian is conscious, are merely variations of the same diseased state. The interpretation of an attack of epilepsy by means of a particular formula which is provided, not by science, but by religious mania. When a man is ill, his very goodness is sickly. By far the greatest portion of the psychical apparatus which Christianity has used is now classed among the various forms of hysteria and epilepsy. The whole process of spiritual healing must be remodeled on a physiological basis. The, quote, sting of conscience, end quote, as such is an obstacle in the way of recovery. As soon as possible, the attempt must be made to counterbalance everything by means of new actions, so that there may be an escape from the morbidness of self-torture. The purely psychical practices of the Church and of the various sects should be decried as dangerous to the health. No invalid is ever cured by prayers or by the exorcising of evil spirits. The states of quote-unquote repose, which follow upon such methods of treatment, by no means inspire confidence in the psychological sense. A man is healthy when he can laugh at the seriousness and ardor with which he has allowed himself to be hypnotized to any extent by any detail in his life, when his remorse seems to him like the action of a dog biting a stone, when he is ashamed of his repentance. The purely psychological and religious practices which have existed hitherto only led to an alteration in the symptoms. According to them, a man had recovered when he bowed before the cross, and swore that in future he would be a good man. But a criminal, who with a certain gloomy seriousness cleaves to his fate and refuses to malign his deed once it is done, has more spiritual health. The criminals with whom Dostoevsky associated in prison were all, without exception, unbroken natures. Are they not 100 times more valuable than a broken-spirited Christian? For the treatment of pangs of conscience, I recommend Mitchell's treatment. 234. A pang of conscience in a man is a sign that his character is not yet equal to his deed. There is such a thing as a pang of conscience after good deeds. In this case, it is their unfamiliarity, their incompatibility with an old environment. 235. Against remorse. I do not like this form of cowardice in regard to one's own actions. One must not leave oneself in the lurch under the pressure of a sudden shame or distress. Extreme pride is much more fitting here. What is the good of it all in the end? No deed gets undone because it is regretted, no more than because it is forgiven or expiated. A man must be a theologian in order to believe in a power that erases faults. We immoralists prefer to disbelieve in quote-unquote faults. We believe that all deeds, of what kind soever, are identically the same at root, just as deeds which turn against us may be more useful from an economical point of view, and even generally desirable. In certain individual cases, we admit that we might well have been spared a given action. The circumstances alone predisposed us in its favor. Which of us, if favored by circumstances, would not already have committed every possible crime? That is why one should never say, quote, "Thou shouldst never have done such and such a thing," end quote, but only, quote, "How strange it is that I have not done such and such a thing hundreds of times already," end quote. As a matter of fact, only a very small number of acts are typical acts and real epitomes of a personality. And seeing what a small number of people really are personalities, a single act very rarely characterizes a man. Acts are most dictated by circumstances. They are superficial or merely reflex movements performed in response to a stimulus, long before the depths of our beings are affected or consulted in the matter. A fit of temper, a gesture, a blow with a knife, how little of the individual resides in these acts. A deed very often brings a sort of stupor or feeling of constraint in its wake, so that the agent feels almost spellbound at its recollection, or as though he belonged to it, and were not an independent creature. This mental disorder, which is a form of hypnotism, must be resisted at all costs. Surely a single deed, whatever it be, when it is compared with all one has done, is nothing, and may be deducted from the sum without making the account wrong. The unfair interest which society manifests in controlling the whole of our lives in one direction, as though the very purpose of its existence were to cultivate a certain individual act, should not infect the man of action, but unfortunately this happens almost continually. The reason of this is that every deed, if followed by unexpected consequences, leads to a certain mental disturbance, no matter whether the consequences be good or bad. Behold a lover who has been given a promise, or a poet while he is receiving applause from an audience. As far as intellectual torpor is concerned, these men are in no way different from the anarchist who is suddenly confronted by a detective bearing a search warrant. There are some acts which are unworthy of us, acts which, if they were regarded as typical, would set us down as belonging to a lower class of man. The one fault that has to be avoided here is to regard them as typical. There is another kind of act which we are unworthy, exceptional acts born of a particular abundance of happiness and health. They are the highest waves of our spring tides, driven to an unusual height by a storm, an accident. Such acts and quote-unquote deeds are also not typical. An artist should never be judged according to the measure of his works. 236. A. In proportion as Christianity seems necessary today, man is still wild and fatal. B. In another sense, it is not necessary, but extremely dangerous, though it is captivating and seductive, because it corresponds with the morbid character of whole classes and types of modern humanity. They simply follow their inclinations when they aspire to Christianity. They are decadents of all kinds. A and B must be kept very sharply apart. In the case of A, Christianity is a cure, or at least a taming process. Under certain circumstances, it serves the purpose of making people ill, and this is sometimes useful as a means of subduing savage and brutal natures. In the case of B, it is a symptom of illness itself. It renders the state of decadence more acute. In this case, it stands opposed to a corroborating system of treatment. It is the invalid's instinct against that which would be most salutary to him. 237. On one side there are the serious, the dignified and reflective people, and on the other the barbarous, the unclean, and the irresponsible beasts. It is merely a question of taming animals, and in this case the tamer must be hard, terrible, and awe-inspiring, at least to his beasts. All essential requirements must be imposed upon the unruly creatures with almost brutal distinctness, that is to say, magnified 1,000 times. Even the fulfillment of the requirement must be presented in the coarsest way possible, so that it may command respect, as in the case of the spiritualization of the Brahmins. The struggle with the rabble and the herd. If any degree of tameness and order has been reached, the chasm separating these purified and regenerated people from the terrible remainder must have been bridged. This chasm is a means of increasing self-respect in higher castes, and of conforming their belief in that which they represent, hence the Chandala. Contempt and its excess are perfectly correct psychologically. That is to say, magnified 100 times, so that it may at least be felt. 238. The struggle against brutal instincts is quite different from the struggle against morbid instincts. It may even be a means of overcoming brutality by making the brutes ill. The psychical treatment practiced by Christianity is often nothing more than the process of converting a brute into a sick and therefore tame animal. The struggle against raw and savage natures must be a struggle with weapons which are able to affect such natures. Superstitions and such means are therefore indispensable and essential. 239. Our age, in a certain sense, is mature, that is to say, decadent, just as Buddha's was. That is why a sort of Christianity is possible without all the absurd dogmas, the most repulsive offshoots of ancient hybridism. 240. Supposing it were impossible to disprove Christianity, Pascal thinks, in view of the terrible possibility that it may be true, that it is in the highest degree prudent to be a Christian. As a proof of how much Christianity has lost of its terrible nature, today we find that other attempt to justify it, which consists in asserting that even if it were a mistake, it nevertheless provides the greatest advantages and pleasures for its adherents throughout their lives. It therefore seems that this belief should be upheld owing to the peace and quiet it ensures, not owing to the terror of a threatening possibility, but rather out of fear of a life that has lost its charm. This hedonistic turn of thought, which uses happiness as a proof, is a symptom of decline. It takes the place of the proof resulting from power or from that which the Christian mind is most terrible, namely fear. With this new interpretation, Christianity is, as a matter of fact, nearing its stage of exhaustion. People are satisfied with a Christianity which is an opiate, because they no longer have the strength to seek, to struggle, to dare, to stand alone, nor to take up Pascal's position and to share that gloomily brooding self-contempt, that belief in human unworthiness, and that anxiety which believes that it may be damned. But a Christianity, the chief object of which is to soothe diseased nerves, does not require the terrible solution consisting of a God on the cross. That is why Buddhism is secretly gaining ground all over Europe. 241. The humor of European culture. People regard one thing as true, but do the other. For instance, what is the use of all the art of reading and criticizing if the ecclesiastical interpretation of the Bible, whether according to Catholics or Protestants, is still upheld? 242. No one is sufficiently aware of the barbarity of the notions among which we Europeans still live. To think that men have been able to believe that the salvation of the soul depended upon a book, and I am told that this is still believed. What is the good of all scientific education, all criticism, and all hermeneutics, if such nonsense as the Church's interpretation of the Bible has not yet turned the colors of our bodies permanently into the red of shame? 243. Subject for reflection. To what extent does the fatal belief in divine providence, the most paralyzing belief for both the hand and the understanding that has ever existed, continue to prevail? To what extent have the Christian hypothesis and interpretation of life continued their lives under the cover of terms like nature, progress, perfectionment, Darwinism, or beneath the superstition that there is a certain relation between happiness and virtue, unhappiness and sin? That absurd belief in the course of things, and life, and in the instinct of life, that foolish resignation which arises from the notion that if only everyone did his duty, all would go well. All this sort of thing can only have a meaning if one assumes that there is a direction of things sub specie boni. Even fatalism, our present form of philosophical sensibility, is the result of a long belief in divine providence, an unconscious result, as though it were nothing to do with us how everything goes, as though we might let things take their own course, the individual being only a modus of the absolute reality. 244. It is the height of psychological falsity on the part of man to imagine a being according to his own petty standard, who is a beginning, a thing in itself, and who appears to him good, wise, mighty, and precious. For thus he suppresses in thoughts all the causality by means of which every kind of goodness, wisdom, and power comes into existence and has value. In short, elements of the most recent and most conditional origin were regarded not as evolved, but as spontaneously generated, and things in themselves, and perhaps as the cause of all things. Experience teaches us that, in every case in which a man has elevated himself to any great extent above the average of his fellows, every high degree of power always involves a corresponding degree of freedom from good and evil, as also from true and false, and cannot take into account what goodness dictates. The same holds good of a high degree of wisdom. In this case, goodness is just as much suppressed as truthfulness, justice, virtue, and other popular whims and valuations. In fact, is it not obvious that every high degree of goodness itself presupposes a certain intellectual myopia and obtuseness, as also an inability to distinguish at a great distance between true and false, useful and harmful, not to mention the fact that a high degree of power in the hands of the highest goodness might lead to the most baleful consequences, the suppression of evil. In sooth, it is enough to perceive with what aspirations the God of love inspires his believers. They ruin mankind for the benefit of good men. In practice, this same God has shown himself to be a God of the most acute myopia, devilry, and impotence, in the face of the actual arrangement of the universe, and from this the value of his conception may be estimated. Knowledge and wisdom can have no value in themselves, any more than goodness can. The goal they are striving after must be known first, for then only can their value or worthlessness be judged. A goal might be imagined which would make excessive wisdom a great disadvantage. If, for instance, complete deception were a prerequisite to the enhancement of life. Likewise, if goodness were able to paralyze and depress the mainsprings of the great passions. Taking our human life as it is, it cannot be denied that all quote-unquote truth, goodness, holiness, and godliness, in the Christian sense, have hitherto shown themselves to be great dangers. Even now mankind is in danger of perishing, owing to an ideal which is hostile to life. 245. Let anyone think of the loss which all human institutions suffer, when a divine and transcendental higher sphere is postulated, which must first sanction these institutions. By recognizing their worth in this sanction alone, as in the case of marriage, for instance, their natural dignity is reduced, and under certain circumstances denied. Nature is spitefully misjudged in the same ratio as the anti-natural notion of a God is held in honor. Quote-unquote nature, then, comes to mean no more than contemptible, bad. The fatal nature of a belief in God as the reality of the highest moral qualities. Throughout it, all real values were denied and systematically regarded as valueless. Thus, anti-nature ascended the throne. With relentless logic, the last step was reached, and this was the absolute demand to deny nature. 246. By pressing the doctrine of disinterestedness and love into the foreground, Christianity by no means elevated the interest of the species above those of the individual. Its real historical effect, its fatal effect, remains precisely the increase of egotism, of individual egotism, to excess, to the extreme which consists in the belief in individual immortality. The individual was made so important and so absolute by means of Christian values that he could no longer be sacrificed, despite the fact that the species can only be maintained by human sacrifices. All quote-unquote souls became equal before God, but this is the most pernicious of all valuations. If one regards individuals as equals, the demands of the species are ignored, and a process is initiated which ultimately leads to its ruin. Christianity is the reverse of the principle of selection. If the degenerate and sick man, the Christian, is to be of the same value as the healthy man, the pagan, or if he is even to be valued higher than the latter, as Pascal's view of health and sickness would have us value him, the natural course of evolution is thwarted, and the unnatural becomes law. In practice, this general love of mankind is nothing more than deliberately favoring all the suffering, the botched, and the degenerate. It is this love that has reduced and weakened the power, responsibility, and lofty duty of sacrificing men. According to the scheme of Christian values, all that remained was the alternative of self-sacrifice. But this vestige of human sacrifice, which Christianity conceded and even recommended, has no meaning when regarded in the light of rearing a whole species. The prosperity of the species is by no means affected by the sacrifice of one individual, whether in the monastic and ascetic manner, or by means of crosses, stakes, and scaffolds as the quote-unquote martyrs of error. What the species requires is the suppression of the physiologically botched, the weak, and the degenerate. But it was precisely to these people that Christianity appealed as a preservative force. It simply strengthened that natural and very strong instinct of all the weak which bids them protect, maintain, and mutually support each other. What is Christian virtue and love of men, if not precisely this mutual assistance, with a view to survival, this solidarity of the weak, this thwarting of selection? What is Christian altruism, if not the mob egotism of the weak, which divines that everybody looks after everybody else. Every individual will be preserved for a longer period of time. He who does not consider this attitude of mind as immoral, as a crime against life, himself belongs to the sickly crowd and also shares their instincts. Genuine love of mankind exacts sacrifice for the good of the species. It is hard, full of self-control, because it needs human sacrifices. And this pseudo-humanity, which is called Christianity, would fain establish the rule that nobody should be sacrificed. 247. Nothing could be more useful and deserves more promotion than systematic nihilism in action. As I understand the phenomena of Christianity and pessimism, this is what they say. Quote, "We are ripe for nonentity. For us it is reasonable not to be." End quote. This hint from quote-unquote reason in this case is simply the voice of selective nature. On the other hand, what deserves the most rigorous condemnation is the ambiguous and cowardly infirmity of purpose of a religion like Christianity, or rather like the Church, which instead of recommending death and self-destruction, actually protects all the botched and bungled and encourages them to propagate their kind. Problem. With what kind of means could one lead up to a severe form of really contagious nihilism? A nihilism which would teach and practice voluntary death with scientific conscientiousness, and not the feeble continuation of a vegetative sort of life, with false hopes of a life after death. Christianity cannot be sufficiently condemned for having depreciated the value of a great cleansing nihilistic movement, like the one which was probably in the process of formation, by its teaching of the immortality of the private individual, as also by the hopes of resurrection which it held out. That is to say, by dissuading people from performing the deed of nihilism, which is suicide. In the latter's place it puts lingering suicide, and gradually a puny, meager but durable life, gradually a perfectly ordinary, bourgeois, mediocre life, etc. 248. Christian moral quackery. Pity and contempt succeed each other at short intervals, and at the sight of them I feel as indignant as if I were in the presence of the most despicable crime. Here error is made a duty, a virtue, misapprehension has become a knack, the destructive instinct is systematized under the name of redemption. Here every operation becomes a wound, an amputation of those very organs whose energy would be the prerequisite to a return of health. And in the best of cases no cure is effected. All that is done is to exchange one set of evil symptoms for another set. And this pernicious nonsense, this systematized profanation and castration of life, passes for holy and sacred. To be in its service, to be an instrument of this art of healing, that is to say, to be a priest, is to be rendered distinguished, reverent, holy, and sacred. God alone could have been the author of the supreme art of healing. Redemption is only possible as a revelation, as an act of grace, as an unearned gift, made by the Creator himself. Proposition 1. Spiritual health is regarded as morbid and creates suspicion. Proposition 2. The prerequisites of a strong, exuberant life, strong desires and passions, are reckoned as objections against strong and exuberant life. Proposition 3. Everything which threatens danger to man, and which can overcome and ruin him, is evil, and should be torn root and branch from his soul. Proposition 4. Man converted into a weak creature, inoffensive to himself and others, crushed by humility and modesty, and conscious of his weakness. In fact, the quote-unquote sinner. This is the desirable type, and one which can produce by means of a little spiritual surgery. 249. What is it I protest against? That people should regard this paltry and peaceful mediocrity, this spiritual equilibrium which knows nothing of the fine impulses of great accumulations of strength, as something high, or possibly as the standard of all things. Bacon of Verulam says, "The ordinary ruck has praise for the lowest virtues, admiration for the mediocre, and for the highest virtues no sense at all. Christianity as a religion, however, belongs to the vulgus. It has no feeling for the highest kind of virtues. 250. Let us see what the quote-unquote genuine Christian does of all the things which his instincts forbid him to do. He covers beauty, pride, riches, self-reliance, brilliancy, knowledge, and power with suspicion and mud. In short, all culture. His object is to deprive the latter of its clean conscience. 251. The attacks made upon Christianity hitherto have been not only timid, but false. So long as Christian morality was not felt to be a capital crime against life, its apologist had a good time. The question concerning the mere truth of Christianity, whether in regard to the existence of its God or to the legendary history of its origin, not to speak of its astronomy and natural science, is quite beside the point, so long as no inquiry is made into the value of Christian morality. Are Christian morals worth anything, or are they a profanation and an outrage, despite all the arts of holiness and seduction with which they are enforced? The question concerning the truth of the religion may be met by all sorts of subterfuges, and the most fervent believers can, in the end, avail themselves of the logic used by their opponents, in order to create a right for their side to assert that certain things are irrefutable. That is to say, they transcend the means employed to refute them. Nowadays, this trick of dialectics is called Kantian criticism. 252. Christianity should never be forgiven for having ruined such men as Pascal. This is precisely what should be combated in Christianity, namely, that it has the will to break the spirit of the strongest and noblest natures. One should take no rest until this thing is utterly destroyed. The ideal of mankind which Christianity advances, the demands it makes upon men, and its nay and yea relative to humanity. The whole of the remaining absurdities, that is to say, Christian fable, Christian cobweb spinning in ideas and principles, and Christian theology, do not concern us. They might be 1,000 times more absurd, and we should not raise a finger to destroy them. But what we do stand up against is that ideal which, thanks to its morbid beauty and feminine seductiveness, thanks to its insidious and slanderous eloquence, appeals to all cowardices and vanities of wearied souls. And the strongest have their moments of fatigue, as though all that which seems most useful and desirable at such moments, that is to say, confidence, artlessness, modesty, patience, love of one's like, resignation, submission to God, and a sort of self-surrender, were useful and desirable per se, as though the puny, modest abortion which in these creatures takes the place of a soul, this virtuous, mediocre animal and sheep of the flock, which deigns to call itself man, were not only to take precedence of the stronger, more evil, more passionate, more defiant, and more prodigal type of man, who by virtue of these very qualities is exposed to 100 times more dangers than the former, but were actually to stand as an ideal for man in general, as a goal, a measure, the highest desideratum. The creation of this ideal was the most appalling temptation that had ever been put in the way of mankind. For with it, the stronger and more successful exceptions, the lucky cases among men in which the will to power and to growth leads to the whole species man one step farther forward, this type was threatened with disaster. By means of the values of this ideal, the growth of such higher men would be checked at the root. For these men, owing to their superior demands and duties, readily accept a more dangerous life. Speaking economically, it is a case of an increase in costs of the undertaking, coinciding with a greater chance of failure. What is it we combat in Christianity? That it aims at destroying the strong, at breaking their spirit, at exploiting their moments of weariness and debility, at converting their proud assurance into anxiety and conscience trouble, that it knows how to poison the noblest instincts and to infect them with disease, until their strength, their will to power, turns inwards against themselves, until the strong perish through their excessive self-contempt and self-immolation, that gruesome way of perishing of which Pascal is the most famous example. This is the end of part 6 of The Will to Power. Thank you for listening.